Hey, InterVarsity alumni. This is After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. This is both an exciting and potentially tricky transition that you're making, and you might feel a little unsure about the coming weeks and months. We're here to provide you with expert advice, practical skills, and plenty of encouragement as you learn how to keep saying yes to Jesus in your new context. This is After 4, and this podcast is for you, alumni. What's up, alumni? Welcome to After 4, your podcast for navigating life after graduation. I'm your host and guide, John Steele. All right, we're continuing our series on vocational transition, and we're jumping into the first of several conversations with alumni from a variety of professions. They've made the transition into full-time work, they've navigated the change in rhythms from student life to professional life, and they're learning what it means to walk with Jesus in the context of their work. Even if you're not stepping into the same profession, I'm confident that there will be something for you to learn from each conversation. Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Felicia Song, an InterVarsity alumna and Professor of Sociology at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. And Felicia and I are going to talk about navigating a professional career in academia, following Jesus in the university setting, and the unique challenges to finding a healthy work-life balance as a professor. So let's get started with our very first alumni interview of the series. Here's Felicia, and this one's for you, alumni. Hello, Felicia. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm really glad to have you. I'm excited. You're going to be the first interview of this series that we're doing. So last week we set up we laid the foundation for sort of a theology of work, a biblical basis for work. And now we're stepping into, hey, let's talk about some specific professions. Let's sit down with people and just say, what's your experience been like in the full-time working world? Before we get into that though, Felicia, would you please just help me and help our audience get to know you a little bit?
Sure. So I am a sociologist. I work in the area of cultural sociology and study the effects of technology on digital technology, specifically in our everyday lives. So,
okay,
not relevant at all.
No, you have nothing going on right now.
And I am currently teaching at a Christian liberal arts college called Westmont in Santa Barbara, California. I've been here for over a decade. And prior to that, I had spent several years at Louisiana State University down in Baton Rouge. I'm married to a working philosopher who's also an academic.
Wow.
And we have 2 children. It's a full life. And it's always a delight to be a part of something related to InterVarsity, because part of my own formation is through being in an InterVarsity Christian Fellowship chapter during my undergraduate years, and even in my master's program. So it's y'all hold you're occupying a warm part of my heart.
That's awesome. Oh, I love any time that we get to sit down with an alum and just hear stories. I'm excited for us to talk about what does it look like, especially in the context of academia, to make that full transition into full-time professional work in that space. And what does it look like to bring Jesus along? I say Jesus is already there, but what is it like on purpose for you to acknowledge and live into the existence of Jesus in that space, who loves your colleagues, loves your students, who cares deeply about the work that you're doing? And what does it mean to partner with him as you adjust to full-time professional work in the academy? Thinking about the idea of the transition itself. Now, I have not gone through a PhD into full-time academic work, but the understanding I do have is that that's probably a slightly different transition than somebody that gets their bachelor's and then gets hired that summer to step into whatever work they're doing. So as best as you can you kind of just give us an idea of what that process of transition looks like? And then even as you think about maybe some stories of once you made it into that full-time professional work, that first week, that first month, what was happening inside of you as you were making those adjustments?
Yeah, sure. Um, so I think most folks that do doctoral work share the same story in that the joke is that through your doctorate, you become the king or queen of the smallest kingdom ever in all of the universe.
Okay.
You become the expert. You're the only one that knows a lot about something very, very minuscule. And so, you invest a lot of energy in defending
Mm,
your expertise or demonstrating it. Maybe some of us are also teaching classes or TAing classes that are either connected to your area of research or maybe not, but certainly in the discipline. And so I think what happens when you actually move into that first job is that you discover that the classes they ask you to teach aren't necessarily the ones that you know anything about. Um,
that's funny.
and so all the insecurities, imposter syndrome, all
Mm,
the do I really know enough to teach this class is that you've been struggling with or working through during graduate school just comes big time,
mm,
that especially in the beginning. I think the good news is that most of us actually discover that the thing we learn during graduate school isn't just like all that information about that tiny dissertation topic, but what we actually got trained in was that we learned how to learn.
mm,
And so that when you are given a new course in perhaps a class you've never TA'd, maybe a class you've never even taught or been a student in, you know how to learn actually, because you've just spent several years doing that, and that once you just kind of embrace it and start moving into it, you discover you know how to reach out to the existing resources, you know how to be creative, because that is in many ways what you've been doing. um, and so I think that's a lot of the beginning, right? Is and in that sense I think it's like a lot of professional careers where you are adopting a kind of mantle of authority, right? Whether you're the
mm.
doctor or the lawyer, right? Like people are expecting you to be the one in charge who knows what they're talking about, and you aren't sure if you do. Um, but I think most of us discover that no, actually, we can do this. We can stay at least 1 week ahead of our graduate students or our undergraduates.
Yes.
And that's all you need. That's really all you need. Um, and you're going to be fine.
I remember I got to teach for a few years at Minnesota State here in Mankato. And 1 year they handed me a couple sections of statistics, which I'd taken statistics before, but I've certainly never taught it. And there were a couple of different times you find the gaps in your knowledge, even in the classes you did take. And there were times that I was prepping for a class that I was like, I big picture I understand, but there's some wires that have not quite made the connection here, and I'm going to get up in front of class tomorrow. And I don't know how this is going to go, because if somebody asks me a question, I don't know that I'm going to be able to explain it. And I have had multiple times teaching that it was literally as the words were coming out of my mouth from up front that the connections came together. And I was like, wait a second. I understand this now. So go ahead, ask questions, because I can actually give you examples of why this works the way that it does.
Yes. And I mean, and I think that's such a great example, because for some of us, we might encounter that moment and that connection never gets made. Like maybe we never
Right.
actually know what the answer is.
Yeah.
And I think it takes some strength and confidence to be able to say to our students, that's actually a good question. And
Mm,
I actually don't know the answer to that
yes.
right now, but I'm going to go and find out. Right. And I think our students don't necessarily just think like, this person's a hack or, what, right. But that they appreciate that kind of honesty. And then obviously you want to do the work, right? And go consult whatever resources you have. And maybe that's, calling your friend and be like, hey, explain this to me or whatever it is. But that it's okay. My point is it's okay not to know everything. And it's okay to actually admit that in a way that doesn't necessarily mean that you are then conceding your authority in the classroom, right? Like there's a way to still hold the appropriate space, the role that you're supposed to have, that your students need you to take on, right? But still know that, hey, it's okay. And I think that models something to them, actually, right? How to navigate those spaces that we may have some uncertainty on.
Felicia, when you're stepping into a new program or a new department, you have people that already have a history together, that have been colleagues for a while. What's it like stepping into that, coming out of a cohort where you know people, you've gone through some stuff together, into someone else's cohort? Like, What does it look like to rub shoulders with colleagues, and to can you rely on developing like relationships, or is it all just we do the work that we're supposed to do, and what's that process like?
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, I think a lot depends again on if you happen to have a cohort of people that might be getting hired at the same time into that college or university. If there are enough people that are coming in with you, that can be a huge benefit, right? So it can replicate a little bit of maybe what you got to experience in graduate school.
And is that pretty common for that to happen?
Well, again, I think it depends on your context, right? If you're at a smaller college that happens to have been hiring in multiple departments, these people might be in a completely different discipline and different department, but they're also being introduced to the institution in the same way that you are. Or in my case, I guess part of the unusualness of my story is that my doctorate is in sociology, but my first job was not in sociology. My first position was actually in a mass communication and journalism school, because I had studied mass media. And we can talk about this later, but my particular situation is, like I mentioned earlier, I'm married to a working philosopher. So we have what we like to call, in academia, the two-body problem. And so when we were looking for our jobs, we needed two positions instead of just one. And so all that's to say, my first job out of graduate school was in a professional school setting, this mass communication journalism school, and like other professional schools, like law schools or med schools, right? It might have, again, a kind of cohort, right? Because there's lots of different fields within that school that are being addressed. So when I came in, I had another, two or three new colleagues that came in with me, and it was nice to again share that journey. But I think, kind of to the heart of your question, I think that first year is really important because there is a lot of listening and a lot of trying to learn the explicit and implicit things that are being said and practices, and learn what some of the institutional history might be. But I think it also takes a lot of work to ask good questions, find who are the people, and hopefully there might be a few people that actually reach out in the goodness and kindness of their heart to say, hey, do you have any questions about what you see happening here? And to have the courage to ask, hey, this came up in this meeting. I'm just really curious, what was it that happened? Or is there a story there that you think I should know? That first year is key for asking those questions, because it feels
Yeah.
like there's a little bit of like a time, like a window, right, where it's okay to ask those questions because you're new and nobody expects you to know anything. But then if you've been there for 5 years, kind of people think you should know by now or something, right? So, like,
Right.
in some ways, being the new person is wonderful because you can kind of bumble around and be like, I didn't know, like this is how it
Right.
is. But you kind of have to, or it helps to be proactive in saying, hey, can you tell me more about this? So that you can get a sense of the lay of the land. And again, do a lot of listening to figure out how you want to position yourself, navigate whatever is happening in your department or in your institution.
It seems to me that this could all be a fairly tiring process to work your way through, that it's a lot to take in, brand new context, new colleagues, maybe some classes that you didn't even study. So things that you're catching up on yourself as you prepare. How do you develop a healthy work-life balance as you're going through? Like, what recommendations would you give for people wanting to start off well with a healthy balance in that?
I think it's always actually helpful to give yourself permission to know that you're not going to be very balanced
Okay.
that first
Okay.
2 years. I think sometimes the aspiration of balance can for some of us maybe become tyrannical, right? Or even something that creates more suffering because we feel like we should be some way and we're just unable because we're so bogged down by the prep and the grading and right. And so again, giving ourselves permission to just be like, okay, I'm just overwhelmed for this season. And maybe I'm not going to be able to keep up with this part of my life and that part of my life. That's going to be okay. It doesn't mean that part of my life doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that part of my life is not still a priority or life-giving to me. But in this season, this is just what it calls for in it. And with that said, it is also important to not just spend all of our days prepping and doing research and feeling anxious, because the thing with academia, either with teaching or with doing research, is you can always do more. You can always do more. You could always prep that class a little better. You could always read another article to make your argument a little better, right? There's no finish line built in, right? It will never stop unless you stop.
Okay.
And so you have to make it stop and say, I'm going on this run, or I'm taking this ski trip, or I'm going to bake cookies. I'm going to, go on this walk. I'm going to go have coffee with my old friends. We're going to do this. It's in the calendar. Otherwise, the demand will always be there, right? And no one's going to tell you to stop. Your students aren't going to tell you to stop. Your department's not going to tell you to stop. Right? They're just going to be like, oh, you're doing great. And so you'll be like, oh, okay, I'll just do more, right? There's no proper reinforcement that helps you calibrate within academia. And so I think that's one of the trickiest parts is you have to figure out how to calibrate it yourself. It is very intense. And it's okay to have it be that way. It's not going to be that way forever. It will subside. It will get easier. I promise you it does, right? But it is that beginning is it's a steep climb.
Yeah. It sounds like there's a balance between a certain level of acceptance of this is just the way it's going to be and intentionality right alongside of that, of you it's going to be a heavy season, but you also must rest.
Mm-hmm.
And no one in your department or at the university is going to make you rest. They're not like they give you vacation on purpose, and it's up to you to be an adult and to schedule vacation and take it. Does this start to give us some insight into maybe the temptations that can come along in this arena of, like, the Lord is Lord of all. He's Lord of that space, but sometimes we can just try to sit on our own throne in that space. And you even kind of made the joke of, like, you are the king or the queen of this particular very small area of research, and you know more than anybody else does about it. Do those things start to give us some insight into where there's temptation to build your own kingdom in this space instead of purposefully partnering with Jesus as you go about your work?
Right. So academia, I think, has its own rat race. It has its own ladder to climb. In the beginning, it's the publish or perish fear that just keeps you racing, because you're saying, I gotta get this amount of publications done by this time so I can get tenure. And once you get tenure, right, there's always the next. There's the, here's what I need to get done to get promoted. But even apart from that ladder that you might feel in your institution, a lot of us feel that type of journey or hierarchy within our disciplines, like the guild, right? So when I go to an academic conference and I listen to speakers, or I watch other people's, I learn about their research, and I see what they're publishing. There's always that person that's doing more than you are, right?
Yeah.
Or there's that, top flight scholar that is just cranking it out. And everyone, it feels like the guild is saying everyone has to be that person. Everyone needs to achieve what that person has achieved. All the grant money that they're getting, the right awards that they're getting, it is just this sense of, I need to be successful, or at least as successful as that person. And if I'm not, somehow I failed. And I think that the temptation there is that it can run counter to whatever calling got you into the whole thing in the first place. And this is where I think it's important for any graduate student, and I'm sure if they're going through the doctorate, that they've asked themselves this question many times: why am I doing this?
Yeah.
But there needs to be an answer, right? Like that is connected to, I think God is calling me to blank, right? I think God is calling me to mentor students. I think God is calling me to do research in this area, to be a part of the healing and redemption of this earth. I believe God is calling me to be a part of this public conversation and of that requires some degree of expertise, so we can move the needle in a way that encourages flourishing for everyone. Whatever that calling is, it can be really hard to hold on to that vision, because the guild or the discipline gives you usually just one template, right? Like, this is what success is, this is what fulfillment is. And I can only live and breathe for 24 hours a day. I can't do everything. So I need to make hard choices and invest my time wisely.
Keeping in mind the calling that you have been given, the things that you and Jesus have worked out together as He's drawn you into this space over this long period of time. What does it look like to walk with Jesus into this context of the university setting?
That's a really good question. I think there are practical things that we can be doing. So that can look like getting connected or remaining connected with a community, a faith community that either already understands that vision that you have, that calling, or one that can support you and help walk alongside you in that calling. So it's a community. And community, quite frankly, I don't know. I think when I think community, my tendency is to think, oh, a large group of people, a church, a whole, right? At least
Right.
15. But when I say community, I mean, that could be like two people, or just, sometimes it's one who you can just always call and help recalibrate you when you're not sure, you feel confused. But being in amongst people who appreciate that vision, whatever it is, and recognize how that syncs up with who God has created you to be and wants to celebrate that with you is so necessary, right? And that might be local. Hopefully you can find a group that's local, but that's not always the case. And that might have to be folks that you've known during grad school or other people. I also actually find that, a lot of us that go through graduate school and are in academia, we're inspired by the books that we've read or the authors of the books that we've read, right? And so those people might cast a particular vision for us, right? And so, for example, some of us might, for me in grad school, N.T. Wright played a big role in just demonstrating both like incredible levels of scholarship, right? Like profound excellence, but also this capacity to be pastoral and write for a general audience. And that has always been, for me, a really inspiring model because I've always been interested in writing for general audiences, right? Even though I've known I've never been able to get to N.T. Wright's level of scholarship, but just to see that's a possibility, right? And to know how impactful his more general audience writings are, certainly for me, that's always kind of been super helpful, right? And having particular models of people that are doing the thing or some part of the thing that you feel called to.
Yeah. So you've got your community that you can sort of reach out to, grab a hold of, and say, help me keep my wits about me as I'm walking through this process. And then you have your people who are doing the thing already that you sense that like this is where the Lord is taking me, which is really helpful because it feels like that can stand in appropriate tension with that pinnacle person in your department or in your discipline that feels like the pull to this. Oh, this is what this setting is telling me I should be, that you have an alternate discipleship that's going on. Felicia, as we come to a close here, I would love to talk to you for like another hour. This has been so great. But do you have one sort of parting piece of advice that you would give to an alum who's going to transition into the world of academia as a profession?
Academia is a wonderful. It is a wonderful calling to have. It provides a lot of flexibility and a lot of independence that many other areas of making a livelihood, it just simply doesn't have. And so it can be beautiful and wonderful. And at the same time, because there aren't as many clear-cut clock in at 9, clock out at 5, here are the tasks to be done, and then you're done. Because there are no boundaries in that sense, it can be really challenging to know when you're just going to turn the lights off and leave the office. And so that I think is the journey that most of us have to go on, and find seasons of thriving and seasons of frustration, and maybe, not doing it so well. But I think for those of us that do feel called to that space, the challenge and maybe even the witness is to live lives of rest and contentment in a field that often, and career that often recommends restlessness and constant working, that we can live out a different way of being. It's a possibility, right, that we can move into.
I really love that even just modeling a healthy life rhythm is something that could be a light in this setting. Felicia, thank you so much for giving your time and sharing your wisdom and experience in the academic space to give just really such real life practical advice for our alumni who will be stepping into a similar space as you. So thanks a lot for making this investment of time into our alumni who will be doing this.
For sure. It's really been a pleasure, John.
In one way or another, I think this will probably be something to keep an eye on in every profession that we touch on, and even in the ones that we don't. But one of the things that stands out to me about stepping into a career in the university setting is work-life balance. The words I used to describe Dr. Song's perspective on this were acceptance and intentionality. It sounds like finding your footing in this environment is going to be overwhelming. It just will be. Between acclimating to a new university setting, getting to know new colleagues, inevitably navigating a renewed sense of imposter syndrome for a time, and potentially teaching courses or topics that you've never studied yourself, it's going to feel like too much at times. There's a level of imbalance that's going to happen no matter what, and you're going to need to be able to accept that. But that doesn't mean that you just lay down and give in to making work your whole life. You must be intentional in making healthy spaces to rest. It might not be to the degree you'd like or that you're used to for a season, but it needs to happen somehow. How can you start planning now for inserting meaningful moments of rest as you step into this setting in the future? And whether or not you'll be working in the world of academia after graduation, I imagine that this will be the case for many of you. Your transition to work will inevitably feel overwhelming at one time or another. There will be more to do than there are hours in the day. What does it look like to accept that and make space for appropriate rest and retreat with Jesus? Dr. Song, thank you so much for joining us this week and for providing this wealth of useful insight on navigating the transition into full-time work in the university setting. Alumni, next week we're going to connect with Valerie, an alumna working as a travel nurse, and Valerie's going to help us get a feel for the transition into full-time work in the world of nursing and healthcare and share about some of the unique opportunities to partner with Jesus in that setting. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you in the after, alumni. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today, alumni. If there was anything that you learned, really enjoyed, or that encouraged you from today's episode, would you send us a DM or tag us in a story? We'd love to hear about it. You can find us at After4Pod on Instagram and Facebook. And if you haven't already, take just a second to unlock your phone and subscribe to the podcast. If your platform lets you, leave us a rating and a review. And if you like what we're doing here, share us with your InterVarsity or other post-graduation friends. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you in the after, alumni.